It had been 3 years of bloody and uncompromising warfare. The 23 states fighting for the Union had hurled massive armies across the rivers and borders of the southern states in an effort to bring the conflict to a conclusion. The 13 Confederate states had responded with scrappy legions, led by an uncommon collection of daring and innovative leaders. Despite an ever-tightening blockade of southern ports and a clear superiority in manpower, economic resources, and industrial strength, the Union forces had been unable to gain a decisive advantage. Northern successes along the western rivers had been offset by a succession of brilliant Confederate victories in Virginia. Now it was 1864, an election year for the Union President Abraham Lincoln. Although he had broad support, a growing number of people, appalled by the mounting casualties, were advocating an early peace settlement with the South. Lincoln had real reason to be concerned about re-election and was convinced that military successes would overcome the dissatisfaction in the North with the war effort thus far and defeat his political opposition. Victories on the battlefield require a winning general. Lincoln had been through many commanders for the Army of the Potomac, searching for a man who could win. The current commander was George Gordon Meade, whose stubborn defense at Gettysburg had forced Lee to abandon his second northern invasion. But Lincoln felt that Meade had allowed Lee to escape and continued to search for someone who would settle for nothing less than the complete destruction of the Southern Army. He settled on Ulysses S. Grant, a former regular Army officer whose recent successes included the capture of the vital Mississippi River town of Vicksburg. Grant was to have command of all the Union armies, east and west, and was given the rank of lieutenant general, which had been retired for years. Grant quickly decided to travel with the Eastern Army, although he elected to leave Meade in direct command of the army itself. He knew that Lee was the man to beat if the war was to be won. William Tecumseh Sherman would replace him as commander of the Western armies. A trusted subordinate, Sherman could be counted on to press federal forces in the West on to victory. The new commander-in-chief brought a different philosophy to the Northern war effort. Determined to bring the full weight of Yankee superiority to bear on the Confederates, he sketched out a plan that coordinated campaigns in all theaters of war, knowing the South could not stretch their dwindling manpower resources to meet all the threats. Sherman in the West and 100,000 veterans would drive on Atlanta. Major General Franz Sigel was ordered to take his 26,000 men and strike south through the Shenandoah Valley, a vital source of food for Southern troops. Benjamin Butler, with 30,000 men, would advance north along the James River towards Richmond, while Meade, Grant, and the 120,000 men of the Army of the Potomac would concentrate on Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia. Following Gettysburg, Lee's army was severely reduced by casualties and desertion. In January of 1864, he counted only 45,000 men present for duty. Still on detached duty in the West were more than 25,000 men under James Longstreet. Lee sent urgent telegrams to Jefferson Davis in an effort to consolidate every available man and replenish his ranks. The Confederacy was truly scraping the barrel. Throughout the winter of 1863-64, Lee and Meade had maneuvered around each other like boxers. each seeking an opportunity to strike a decisive blow to the other. A few fights had erupted, but the sparring had resulted in little gain for either side. Grant took advantage of the lull in fighting to reorganize the Army of the Potomac, consolidating 5 Army Corps into 3, bringing Philip Sheridan east to command a newly revitalized cavalry corps, and abolishing the prisoner exchange program that benefited the Southern forces more than the Union armies. All of these reforms took time to implement, however, time that was critical to the Confederates. And by the time Grant was ready to advance, Lee had gathered together just over 70,000 men to contest the Yankees. On May 2, 1864, Lee and his officers rode to the top of Clark Mountain and surveyed the terrain. Below them lay the Rapidan River. Certain that Grant would attempt to turn his right flank and would be directed by President Lincoln to stay between Washington and the Confederate Army, Lee correctly predicted that the Army of the Potomac would cross the river at Germanna Ford and Eli's Ford. 2 days later, the Union 5th and 6th Corps did cross the Rapidan River at both places, just as Lee had predicted. As the soldiers of the Army of the Potomac plunged into the dense forests of the wilderness, many experienced a feeling of foreboding. One New York soldier recalled, "A sense of ominous dread which many of us found it almost impossible to shake off." Grant's strategy was to move through the wilderness as quickly as possible and draw Lee's army out into open ground where he could make his advantage in men and artillery felt. Lee was well aware of the strength of the Union Army and knew that his best hope of neutralizing Grant's advantage was to catch him en route on the narrow paths through the forests. Thus he sent the Confederate Third Corps under A.P. Hill into the wilderness via the Orange Plank Road. The Second Corps under Richard Ewell took the Orange Turnpike, and the First Corps under James Longstreet was to catch up as quickly as possible and follow Hill's men in. Grant's route through the wilderness was along the Germanna Plank Road to the Brock Road, which put his columns moving at right angles to Lee's advancing corps. If the Confederates were swift enough, they would cut Grant's column in half. The Federal soldiers were on the move by 5 a.m. Hancock's Second Corps led the way, with Warren's Fifth Corps behind. By 7 a.m., a halt was ordered. Union skirmishers had encountered Confederates in the woods west of the line of march, and Meade wanted an immediate attack launched. Hancock's rear division turned to the west and dug in. Warren's men formed in line of battle facing west and plunged into the undergrowth, struggling to maintain their formations. Sedgwick's Sixth Corps was ordered up on Warren's right to support the attack. Meade signaled Grant that he felt that Lee was simply demonstrating to gain time and that he was prepared to punish him. The Confederates under Ewell knew the attack was coming and quickly formed to meet them. Barely minutes after their lines were deployed, the Yankees burst into a clearing called Sanders Field, and the fight was on. Federal attacks were met with terrific volleys and determined resistance, and the Union left was quickly turned back. Artillery ordered to the front to support the attack fared little better. One section of the 1st New York had barely gone into battery when virtually all of the horses and men were cut down. The 2 abandoned guns would remain in no man's land until the end of the battle. In the center, the Bluecoats had better luck, piercing the Confederate line. The Union right flank regiments also gained some initial success, but were counterattacked and thrown back. During this movement, one Federal unit, Company F of the 20th Maine, whose defense of Little Round Top at Gettysburg had become legendary, became separated from its brigade and lost in the woods. Determined to rejoin their brigade, they cautiously made their way back in the direction they had come. They soon found that they were cut off and behind Confederate lines with two choices: surrender or fight their way out.
Keep going.
Yes, sir.
Though they numbered only 17 men, they quickly decided to fight. Fixing their bayonets, they quietly closed on the rear of the Confederate line that stood between them and their comrades. With a rush, they fell on the unsuspecting rebels, many of whom scattered. Quickly rounding up more than 30 prisoners, they hustled them back to their lines. In the confused and often blind fighting that raged in the woods, such stories were common. Units were splintered by the impenetrable forests, and often found themselves fighting in all directions, with no idea where their own lines or those of the enemy were. One Federal officer characterized the fight as a blind wrestle. Ewell finally stabilized his line in the center by counterattacking with General John Gordon's Georgia Brigade, and the fighting in this sector died down. Further south, A.P. Hill's troops had deployed on either side of the Orange Plank Road and were attacking Hancock's rear division under Richard Getty. Getty's men fought hard, although outnumbered, as Hancock rushed the rest of his corps to the scene. Soon 17,000 Union troops were massing to attack Heth and his 7,000 men. Heth's soldiers had thrown up light breastworks where they had stopped and met the Union counterattack with a withering fire. The Union attack stalled. Even the addition of a fresh division could not break the rebel line. Both sides were taking a brutal beating, and all the men prayed for darkness. Elements of the 6th Corps arrived to strengthen the Union lines, and a few attacks were met with counterattacks, all to little avail. The gathering darkness added to the smoke-laden gloom that hung over the entire area. The ring of axes could be heard everywhere, as both sides struggled to bolster their defensive positions. In many places, the woods had caught fire from intense fighting, and many of the wounded, unable to crawl to safety, burned to death. Their screams haunted the living and created a hellish night for all. Both Lee and Grant planned to attack the next day, May the 6th, as early as possible. Grant now had all his men available, as Burnside's 9th Corps was at hand. He ordered him to move into the gap between Lee's two corps. Hancock was ordered to attack with everything he could muster and was reinforced by a division of the 6th Corps. Sedgwick and Warren were to keep pressure on Ewell to prevent Lee from shifting troops from that part of the field to assist Hill. Hancock would have 20,000 men to attack the still disorganized Southerners. Lee was still awaiting the arrival of Longstreet's 1st Corps and Richard Anderson's division, together about 20,000 of the Army's best fighters. Would they arrive in time? Or would Lee's gamble to take on the Federals in the wilderness turn into disaster for the Confederates? Hancock's attack rolled forward at 5 a.m., and the rebels soon fell back in the face of overwhelming numbers. Lee watched nervously as his men began streaming back through the woods. Where was Longstreet? For a while, the only thing standing between the Federal host and disaster for the Confederates were 12 guns under the command of William Pogue. Working feverishly, Pogue's artillery bought precious time for the Southern Army. But the terrain was having its disruptive effect on the Federal attack. Lines became disoriented and broken. Advanced units were hopelessly entangled in the undergrowth. And just as victory seemed certain, the advance bogged down. At this critical moment, Longstreet appeared with his divisions close behind. Lee reacted with uncharacteristic enthusiasm. As Longstreet's leading brigades formed up for battle, Lee rode up and asked what unit this was. General John Gregg replied that it was the Texas Brigade. Waving his hat, Lee cried, "Hooray for Texas! Go and drive these people." With reckless abandon, Lee started to ride forward with them. Shouts of "Lee to the rear!" rose from the ranks, but Lee continued forward. Finally, an enlisted man took his horse's bridle and led him back. It was clear that Lee felt the battle hung in the balance, a point that was not lost on the Texans. Longstreet's men tipped the scales back in favor of the Confederates, driving Hancock's men back almost to their starting positions. As the two lines battled to a stalemate, Longstreet ordered a flank attack that struck the Yankees' right and rolled up the line for some distance before Federal reinforcements halted the advance. As Longstreet rode down the Orange Plank Road, the 12th Virginia was stumbling back through the woods in a disorganized condition. Mistaking them for attacking Yankees, troops of William Mahone's Confederate Brigade opened fire, killing the color bearer. The crossfire caught Longstreet's party in the open, killing 3 members of his staff, including Brigadier Micah Jenkins, a promising young officer, and wounding Longstreet himself. Just 1 year earlier, a nearly identical incident had mortally wounded Stonewall Jackson in these same woods. Longstreet's wound would not prove fatal, but it would deprive Lee of his most trusted subordinate, and Lee took over his command. Throughout the campaign so far, A.P. Hill had been too ill to command effectively, and now the temporary loss of Longstreet meant that Lee had only one of his regular corps commanders, Ewell, still in active command. It was a situation that Lee, who normally left tactical field command to his subordinates, found difficult. The final action of the day occurred on the Confederate left flank, when Gordon's brigade, together with another, swept in on Sedgwick's 6th Corps from an unexpected direction. After inflicting 400 casualties and capturing several hundred prisoners, Gordon's attack was stopped by darkness and Federal reinforcements. The attack had occasioned an outburst from Grant when a panicked officer had reported Gordon's attack and overstated the size and success of the assault. Grant angrily muttered, "I am tired of hearing about what Lee is going to do. Some of you always seem to think he is suddenly going to turn a double somersault and land in our rear and on both flanks at the same time. Go back to your command and try to think about what we are going to do ourselves, instead of what Lee is going to do." Lee's casualties in the 2 days of fighting in the wilderness by some counts, stood at 7,500. Grant's columns had lost 17,600. And as the two columns glared at each other over the nightmarish landscape of charred trees and corpses, Grant pondered his next move. Traditionally, Union armies after such a battle would have withdrawn over the Rapidan to refit, fill the depleted ranks, and try again later. Another option was to move towards Fredericksburg, where the long trains of ambulances were now headed. But Grant had already proven that he had no patience for the way the war had been fought up till now. In one of the most momentous decisions of the entire war, Grant issued a command to General Meade on the morning of May 7th. The order began with the words, "Make all preparations during the day for a night march to take position at Spotsylvania Courthouse with one corps." The direction would be southeast, towards Richmond. Grant would not retreat. In fact, never again would the Army of the Potomac move backwards. The men in the ranks sensed that there was indeed a new man in charge. That evening, the Federal columns began to move out. With Warren's men in the lead, the Union troops would take the Brock Road towards Spotsylvania, with Hancock's corps following. Burnside would take a longer route, designed to bring him down on Spotsylvania from the north. Sedgwick was to follow Burnside to Chancellorsville, then turn south to support Warren and Hancock. Grant and Meade knew that speed was important, and the Federal cavalry moved out in front to secure the vital crossroads before the Confederates could arrive. Lee was prepared for such a move, however. He had had the foresight to order his engineers to cut roads through the forests behind the Confederate lines during the Wilderness fight. When he received word that the Yankees were on the move, he guessed their destination and quickly ordered his own cavalry to take up positions blocking the Union advance. The infantry was then put on the road towards Spotsylvania Courthouse. The foot race was on. If Lee failed to get there first, Grant's army would be astride an important supply line, and Lee would be forced to fight in the open against a superior force. The Southern infantry had to win this race.
Thanks for watching. If you'd like to help us produce more compelling historical content like this, please like, comment below, and share this video with fellow history buffs. And of course, be sure to subscribe to help keep history happening.